hemlock knots. Cracking the Restoration's toughest subjects through rational, balanced analysis of source material.
As I've studied Brigham Young's talks and letters, as well as the accounts of those that personally interacted with him, I've realized he was a very different man than has often been portrayed in church publications. The church's account of the rescue of the Willie and Martin handcart companies is a good example of selectively assembled history. The recently published Saints Volume 2 perpetuates the same types of exclusions and misrepresentations. While working at church headquarters for several years, I noticed a tendency to publish only things that presented the church in a positive light, even if they ignored important aspects of the truth. I believe the Holy Ghost inspires us to search for and share truth, and a religion that prefers a polished but inaccurate view of its past will eventually become a stumbling block to its adherents. In 1856, the first year President Brigham Young had emigrants cross the plains using handcarts, over 200 members died in the Willie and Martin handcart companies. To put that number in context, in the infamous Donner Party disaster that occurred a decade before, a total of 39 pioneers died. Brigham initiated the handcart plan to save money. Toward the end of the 1855 emigration season, Brigham was surprised by the amount of debt that church agents had incurred to bring converts to Utah in wagon trains. In a church talk, Brigham explained that, quote, "Our agents have run us in debt almost $50,000 to strangers, merchants, cattle dealers, and our brethren who are coming here. There are men who have lately arrived in town who have a draft on me, and who have hunted me up for the cash before they could find time to shave their beards or wash themselves. I will pay you when I can, and not before." 2 weeks later, Brigham wrote a letter to Apostle Franklin D. Richards, who was serving as the president of the British mission, announcing his plan to decrease the expense of future immigrations. In Brigham's words, quote, "I have been thinking how we should operate another year. We cannot afford to purchase wagons and teams as in times past. I am consequently thrown back upon my old plan to make handcarts and let the emigration foot it and draw upon them the necessary supplies, having a cow or two for every 10. They can come just as quick, if not quicker, and much cheaper." End quote. Members that were eventually assigned to one of the first 5 handcart companies that crossed the plains in 1856 left from England on 4 different ships starting in March of that year, with the last ones departing 2 months later in May. The 5 handcart companies, the Ellsworth, MacArthur, Bunker, Willie, and Martin companies, left Florence, Nebraska within about a month of each other, the first on July 20th and the last on August 25th. The first 3 handcart companies had already arrived in Salt Lake when, on October 4th, Apostle Richards, who had passed the Willie and Martin handcart companies on his return trip back to Utah from England, arrived in Salt Lake and described their precarious situation to President Young. The Church's Saints Volume 2 describes Apostle Richards' report to Brigham as follows, starting at the top of the slide. On October 4th, the evening they arrived in Salt Lake City, they, meaning Elder Franklin D. Richards, Daniel Spencer, who was the church's agent at the Iowa campgrounds where the handcart companies were outfitted, and some other returning missionaries. Franklin told the First Presidency that the Willie and Martin companies and 2 wagon companies were 500, maybe 600 miles away. Altogether, more than 1,000 saints were still east of the Rocky Mountains, and Franklin did not think that the Martin Company would be able to arrive before the end of November. Franklin's report alarmed the presidency. Knowing some companies had left England late in the season, they had assumed that Franklin and the immigration agents would instruct them to wait until spring to come west. This text underlined in red that they, meaning the First Presidency, had assumed that Franklin and the immigration agents would instruct them, which included the last 2 handcart companies, to wait until spring to come west, is very important to the story of the handcart rescue, as it seeks to absolve Brigham of responsibility for the handcart disaster. The problem is, based on letters Brigham wrote before Apostle Franklin D. Richards arrived in Salt Lake on October 4th, it appears to not be true. In letters Brigham wrote to Apostle George Q. Cannon in August and September of 1856, Brigham indicated that he expected all the handcart companies to cross the plains and come to Utah that year. In this letter, written on August 4th, 1856, 2 months before Elder Richards arrived in Salt Lake and informed Brigham that the last 2 handcart companies were at risk, Brigham told Apostle George Q. Cannon in this letter that he expected the Willie and Martin companies to be leaving Florence, Nebraska for Utah sometime in August. In that August 4th letter to Apostle Cannon, Brigham wrote, "We have received advices that about 2,000 saints are expected to cross the plains this year on foot with handcarts." There were about 1,900 handcart pioneers that made up the 5 different handcart companies that crossed the plains in 1856. The about 2,000 Brigham alludes to in his letter represent all the handcart emigrants that year. Once again, in Brigham's words, quote, "We have received advices that about 2,000 saints are expected to cross the plains this year on foot with handcarts. Over 800 had started, and the remainder were to start in a few weeks per last advices." The over 800 that had started were the 815 pioneers that made up the first 3 handcart companies, named after their captains, Ellsworth, MacArthur, and Bunker. The remainder that were to start in a few weeks per last advices were the remaining 2 handcart groups, the Willie and Martin companies. Brigham's understanding that, quote, "the remainder were to start in a few weeks," after August 4th, when he wrote the letter, indicates he expected the last companies to leave Florence, Nebraska sometime in August. This church timeline shows the Willie Company left Florence on August 16th and that the Martin Company left on August 25th, both of which are in line with Brigham's expectations in his August 4th letter that he expected them to start their journeys westward from Nebraska, quote, "in a few weeks," end quote. Brigham wrote to Apostle George Q. Cannon again a month later, on September 4th, 1856, and explained that the handcart companies were expected to arrive very late in the season. Brigham makes no mention of any of the handcart companies waiting to cross the plains until the next year. In Brigham's words, "Our emigration are very late, especially the handcart trains. We have forwarded large quantities of flour to their relief, but we have not as yet received any definite information concerning them." What would Brigham have meant when he said he expected the handcart trains to be, quote-unquote, very late? Tracking immigration wagon train arrival dates in Salt Lake from 1847 to 1852, 26% arrived before September 15th. The majority, 66%, arrived between the middle of September and the first week of October, and 8% arrived after October 7th, with the latest arriving on October 27th. Brigham's expectation was that the handcart pioneers would be able to travel, quote, "just as quick, if not quicker," end quote, than pioneers in ox-drawn wagon trains, because the handcart pioneers wouldn't have to deal with finding pasture for the oxen in the evenings and gathering them up to start each morning. Based on what Brigham understood in his August 4th letter about when the handcart trains would leave from Florence, only the last 2 would have been expected to arrive very late. The first 2 handcart trains arrived in Salt Lake on September 26th, and the third arrived on October 2nd, all within typical arrival dates. If Brigham had expected the Willie and Martin companies to stay in Florence until spring, he wouldn't have had reason to be concerned about any of the handcart trains arriving very late. So why would church historians claim that Brigham assumed that Elder Richards and the immigration agents would instruct the Willie and Martin handcart companies to wait until spring to come west, when that was clearly not the case? They claim it because Brigham changed his story about what he knew and when he knew it to avoid blame for the unfolding handcart disaster. On October 30th, several weeks after Elder Franklin D. Richards' arrival in Salt Lake, Brigham wrote a letter to Apostle Orson Pratt in which he changed his story and claimed he didn't know the last 2 handcart companies were coming west until Franklin D. Richards alerted him to that fact on October 4th. In Brigham's words, quote, "The immigration is too late. This is an evil that must be remedied in future. We now give you positive instructions that so far as you control the immigration to come across the plains, not to permit any company to leave the Missouri River later than the 1st of August, end quote, which makes sense as the Willie Company left on August 16th and the Martin Company left on August 25th. Brigham continues, "We have just received an express from Captain Willie's company of handcarts. They are supposed to be now about Green River as the express left there on Sunday morning, the 26th inst., meaning the 26th of October, near the South Pass." Skipping to the bottom, this Captain Willie's company had a pretty severe time in a storm that lasted 2 days and then cleared up cold. The relief sent was timely, but none too soon. Notice that this is where Brigham changes his story. "We sent, however, just as soon as we learned that they were coming, which was not until Brothers Franklin, Spencer, and others arrived on the evening of the 4th inst., or the 4th of October. We have also forwarded since that time a great many times, designing to pick them up and bring them all in. Let this be a lesson to us in future, not to start companies across the plains so late. It is a great mistake. The first 3 companies came through in good time and were extremely successful, and they were quite late enough. Here Brigham repeats his revised story a second time. We had no idea there were any more companies upon the plains until our brethren arrived, presuming that they would consider their late arrival in America and not start them across the plains until another year. But so it is, and now too late to remedy. To summarize, this is the crux of the conflict in Brigham's letters. On August 4th, he reported that about 2,000 saints are expected to cross the plains this year on foot with handcarts. And nearly 3 months later, he wrote, "We had no idea there were any more companies upon the plains until our brethren arrived, presuming that they would consider their late arrival in America and not start them across the plains until another year. But so it is, and now too late to remedy." What kind of pressure would cause Brigham to lie about expecting the last 2 handcart companies to wait until the next year to cross the plains? To Brigham, member confidence in his managerial ability was crucial to the success of their struggling settlements in the wilderness. 6 months before writing that letter to Apostle Pratt, Brigham explained, "Joseph was called of God. I was called of Joseph. I ask you, have you ever lost one particle of confidence in me? I do not believe there is one being on earth. Now restore your confidence in yourselves and then in one another, and it casts fear on the minds of the world." 8 months before that, he taught, "I tell the brethren that they may understand here today what kind of sacred confidence some of them have in the leader of this people," meaning himself. "I would be ashamed to join a people organized as we are and be afraid to trust their leader." Implicit trust was required in a kingdom where Brigham expected to dictate whatever he saw fit. Several years before, Brigham had explained, "I am accused by our honorable judges who have left this territory last fall of entering into the legislative hall and there dictating them. That is an objection that will be raised and will be presented to President Fillmore, that I entered into the halls of legislature and there dictate them. I do dictate, and I never expect to see the day while I am governor amongst this people that I don't do it, and I want it published abroad, for it is what I believe in, and it is what you believe in." Brigham's views on the importance of members trusting his mandates didn't seem to diminish over time when he was no longer governor. In 1867, he would claim, "The man whom God calls to dictate affairs in the building up of his Zion has the right to dictate about everything connected with the building up of Zion, yes, even to the ribbons the women wear, and any person who denies it is ignorant." So Brigham's letter to Elder Pratt, in which he revised history to claim he thought the Willie and Martin companies were going to wait until the next year to cross the plains, was written during a crisis of member confidence in Brigham's judgment. We know that because 3 days later, first counselor in the first presidency, Heber C. Kimball, talked about it at church. He said, quote, "Some find fault with and blame Brother Brigham and his council because of the sufferings that they have heard that our brethren are enduring on the plains. A few of them have died, and you hear some exclaim, 'What an awful thing it is! Why is it that the first presidency are so unwise in their calculations? But it falls on their shoulders.' Well, the late arrival of those on the plains cannot be helped now, but let me tell you most emphatically that if all who were entrusted with the care and management of this year's emigration had done as they were counseled and dictated by the first presidency of this church, the sufferings and hardships now endured by the companies on their way here would have been avoided. Why? Because they would have left the Missouri River in season and not have been hindered until into September. There is a spirit of murmuring among the people, and the fault is laid upon Brother Brigham. The attempt to shift blame to other church leaders, shown here on public display, was already underway. Brigham had already spoken in this meeting, right before Elder Kimball, but Brigham apparently felt compelled to respond to the indirect accusation in President Kimball's talk. Brigham got up and said, quote, "Brother Kimball in his remarks touched upon an idea that had not previously entered my mind, that is, that some of the people were dissatisfied with me and my counselors on account of the lateness of this season's immigration." Let me ask you a question here. Do you really think the idea that some might hold him accountable for the handcart problem had never entered Brigham's mind? It seems unlikely, especially given the story he crafted 3 days before in his letter to Elder Pratt, blaming other church leaders. Anyway, continuing with the quote, "It never came into my mind that I was in the least degree censurable for any person's being now upon the plains. Why? Because there is not the least shadow of reason for casting such censure upon me," which of course there was, as the handcart plan was Brigham's idea, and this was the first time it had been tried. Continuing with the quote, "There is not a person who knows anything about the council of the first presidency concerning the immigration, but what knows that we have recommended it to start in season." True, we have not expressly, and with a penalty, forbidden the immigration to start late, but hereafter I am going to lay an injunction and place a penalty to be suffered by any elder or elders who will start the emigration across the plains after a given time, and the penalty shall be that they shall be severed from the church, for I am not willing to have such late starts. Although Brigham hadn't publicly thought to institute a rule preventing late starts before, he announced one in this meeting, enforceable by excommunication. The severity of the proposed punishment may have been Brigham's attempt to restore member confidence in his judgment. Next, Brigham again attempts to convince members of his managerial prowess, and then reasons that as a competent manager, he would not mismanage the handcart plan and thus convince members that it couldn't be his fault. Brigham continues, "You know my life. There is not a person in this church and kingdom but what must acknowledge that gold and silver, houses and lands, etc., do multiply in my hands. There is not an individual but what must acknowledge that I am as good a financier as they ever knew in all things I put my hands to. This is well known by the people, and they consider me a frugal, saving man. Therefore, there is no ground or room for their suspecting that my mismanagement caused the present sufferings on the plains. I presume that Brother Kimball never would have thought of such an idea had he not heard it." Next, Brigham attempts to villainize other church leaders by pretending they'd intentionally decided to go against the council of the First Presidency in recommending the late handcart departure when he said, "Well, what shall be done? Why, we must bear it. The elders east fancy that they know more about what is wanted here than we do, and we have to bear it." It's clear that this was not the case. In fact, there's reason to believe that when Apostle Richards and others encouraged the handcart saints to come west in 1856, they did so because they trusted prophecy from the First Presidency that the handcart pioneers would be protected. This excerpt from the 13th General Epistle, published by the First Presidency in the Deseret News in October of 1855, was also published a few months later in the Millennial Star in Britain. This is the epistle that kicked off the handcart campaign. It reads, quote, 13th General Epistle of the Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to the saints in the valleys of the mountains and those scattered abroad throughout the earth, greeting. Later on in the epistle it reads, "Let the poor also come. Whether they receive aid or not from the fund, let them come on foot, with handcarts or wheelbarrows. Let them gird up their loins and walk through, and nothing shall hinder or stay them." End quote. I think it's fair to say that the more than 200 that died in the Willie and Martin companies were clearly hindered, rendering this prophecy inaccurate. There's evidence members believed Brigham's prophecy that handcart immigrants would be protected was a promise from the Lord, as it appeared in this church publication, the Millennial Star, published in England in June of 1856, which reads, quote, "The Lord has promised through his servant Brigham that the handcart companies shall be blessed with health and strength and be met partway with teams and provisions from the valley." Brigham's promise emboldened others to prophesy as well, and Brother John Jacks, who wrote this article, continues, "And I am not afraid to prophesy that those who go by handcarts and continue faithful and obedient will be blessed more than they have ever dreamed of." End quote. Brother Jack's difficult experience as a member of the Martin Handcart Company would ironically not fulfill his own prophecy. By accepting Brigham's revised account that focused blame on other church leaders outside the First Presidency, the church avoids having to deal with the fact that this very high-profile prophecy that nothing shall hinder or stay the handcart immigrants, that emboldened converts to trust the handcart plan, turned out to be false. Many that trusted this assurance lost their lives. That's why pretending that Elder Richards and the other elders' encouragement to the last two handcart companies to cross the plains in 1856 was somehow done in defiance of Brigham and the First Presidency is not just unfair, it's misleading. I'll start again at the beginning. Well, what shall be done? Why, we must bear it. The elders east fancy that they know more about what is wanted here than we do, and we have to bear it. Brigham then asserts that if he had been in charge of the entire immigration operation, he would have run the whole thing more economically, which is a reminder that Brigham launched the handcart plan to save money, and that even at this point he saw the handcart problem in fundamentally financial terms. He also attempts to reinforce a point he consistently makes, which is that he is best suited to be the dictator in Zion because he knows more than everybody else in the kingdom. If that term seems harsh, remember, dictators dictate, and that's exactly what Brigham tells us he wants to do. In his words, "Let me have had the dictation of the emigration from Liverpool, and I could have brought many more persons here, and at a cost of not more than from $3 to $5 of what it has now cost, provided I could have dictated matters at every point. That is not boasting. I only want to tell you that I know more than they know. But what have we to do now? We have to be compassionate, we have to be merciful to our brethren." Brigham goes on to criticize Apostle Richards to reinforce the assertion that he, Brigham, is the smartest leader in the church, and then passive-aggressively suggests that he isn't necessarily blaming Elder Richards. Here is Brother Franklin D. Richards, who has but little knowledge of business except what he has learned in the church. He came into the church when a boy, and all the public business he has been in is the little he has done while in Liverpool, England. And here's Brother Daniel Spencer, Brother Richards' first counselor, and a man of age and experience, and I do not know that I will attach blame to either of them. He then goes on to attach further blame to both of them. But if, while at the Missouri River, they had received a hint from any person on this earth, or even a bird had chirped it in the ears of Brother Richards and Spencer, they would have known better than to rush men, women, and children onto the prairie in the autumn months on the 3rd of September to travel over 1,000 miles. If chirping birds represent voices of suggestion that might have been heeded to the benefit of the Willie and Martin companies, Brigham ignored important chirping himself. After learning that the handcart plan was going to be tried, Apostle John Taylor gathered a group of returned missionaries who'd previously crossed the plains to ask them for suggestions to help the handcart initiative succeed. Before any of the handcart companies attempted to cross the plains, Elder Taylor's council recommended allocating a support wagon and 3 yoke of oxen for each 50 persons, quote, to convey the sick, etc., end quote. Brigham rejected their suggestion in this July 28th letter. In Brigham's words, I will say that it is all right not to provide wagons for infirm persons to accompany the handcarts, for it would encourage infirmity, or rather laziness, which is quite as bad. There would soon be but few able to walk if such arrangements were made. We have hauled such characters with worn-out, broken-down cattle long enough, and we held this year's operation as breaking through and throwing off an immense burden which has long oppressed us. The infirm and lazy were, by his own words, an immense burden to Brigham. The first 3 handcart trains had about 800 men, women, and children that pulled 158 handcarts, supported by only 8 wagons, which was roughly half of the ratio Elder Taylor's experts had recommended. The Willie and Martin companies had a similar ratio of support wagons, with an estimated 12 wagons to support over 1,000 emigrants. If Brigham had listened to the chirping or counsel of Apostle John Taylor and other experienced pioneers to provide more support wagons for the infirm, much suffering might have been avoided. Going back to Brigham's talk, in which he attempts to shift blame to others, he momentarily turned his contempt away from Elder Richards to curse any members that criticized him or his counselors in the first presidency, before revisiting again his financial prowess and asserting that only fools would criticize him. If any man or woman complains of me or of my counselors in regard to the lateness of some of this season's immigration, let the curse of God be on them and blast their substance with mildew and destruction until their names are forgotten from the earth. I never thought of my being accused of advising or having anything to do with so late a start. The people must know that I know how to handle money and means, and I never supposed that anybody had a doubt of it. It will cost this people more to bring in those companies from the plains than it would to have seasonally brought them from the outfitting point on the Missouri River. I do not believe that the biggest fool in the community would entertain the thought that all this loss of life, time, and means was through the mismanagement of the first presidency. I know how to dictate affairs. We are new settlers in a wild and uninhabited country and are thrown upon our own resources. That we need all our teams and means to prepare for those persons who are coming, instead of crippling us by taking our bread, men, and teams and going out to meet them. And if the present system continues, such operations will financially use us up. Brigham continues to repeat himself. I hesitate to quote too much, but I can find no better way to understand who Brigham Young really was than to read his own words. Quote, last year my back and head ached, and I have been about half mad ever since, and that too righteously, because of the reckless squandering of means and leaving me to foot the bills. Last year, without asking me a word of counsel, without a word being spoken to me about the matter, there was over $60,000 of indebtedness incurred for me to pay. What for? To fetch a few immigrants here, when I could have brought the whole of them with 1/4 of the means. What is the cause of our immigration being so late this season? The ignorance and mismanagement of some who had to do with it, and still perhaps they did the best they knew how. Are those people in the frost and snow by my doings? No, my skirts are clear of their blood, God knows. If a bird had chirped in Brother Franklin's ears in Florence, and the brethren there had held a council, he would have stopped the rear companies there, and we would have been putting in our wheat, etc., instead of going on to the plains and spending weeks and months to succor our brethren. I make these remarks because they are true. In case Brigham's accusations to this point were not understood by his audience, remember, these excerpts are from a church talk delivered on a Sunday in the Tabernacle on Temple Square. He makes it clear that any praise voiced in favor of Apostle Richards was misguided. In Brigham's words, quote, "I will mention something more. You cannot hear George D. Grant, Daniel Spencer, or others of the lately returned missionaries speak without eulogizing Franklin D. Richards. They are full of eulogizing Franklin D. Richards, but they need to be careful or they will have the big head and become as dead and devoid of the spirit as old pumpkins. And with them it is, what could I have done without Brother George? And what could we have done without Brother Franklin? And when you hear me calling you Rabbi, know ye that I want to be called Rabbi. And so it goes. But I suppose that this is not what they do it for." A parenthetical observation here that it's interesting to note Brigham's tendency to employ these types of passive-aggressive tactics. Brigham appears here to reference Jesus' condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees who loved the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues and greetings in the markets and to be called of men Rabbi, Rabbi, from the 23rd chapter of the book of Matthew. Brigham continues, "Don't you know that I know whether you are good for anything or not without my praising you? I know all about you, without telling me what great things you have done and what you have not done. But the very spirit some have in them of pride, arrogance, and self-esteem has led men and women to die on the plains, by scores, at least their folly has. And if they had not had any such spirit about them, God would have whispered to them to have held a council, and would have stopped them from rushing their brethren and sisters into such suffering. But we must now rescue those people, and may God help us to do it. Amen." While there was truth behind Brigham's accusations of Elder Richards, Brigham shared responsibility for the disaster. He was responsible for false prophecy that eventually led to more false prophecy by Elder Richards that led to people dying. It didn't occur to Brigham to dictate that the last two companies should stay in Nebraska until it was obvious to all that they had started too late. Brigham's behavior sheds light on his motivation. If Brigham believed he needed to preserve member confidence in his dictates to preserve order in the kingdom, then revising his story to shift blame away from himself and onto others was a way to do that. So what changed in 1855 to cause the church to be unable to afford wagon trains to bring immigrants west? Through 1855, the church had purchased wagons to bring immigrants across the plains, but in 1855, grasshopper infestations and droughts significantly impacted food production and thus tithing receipts. While Brigham liked to perpetuate the idea that his managerial prowess made it impossible for wealth to not multiply in his hands, the reality was that Brigham had stopped doing manual labor in 1852, making him dependent upon the wealth created by the work of others, and he was in the middle of building palatial mansions for his numerous wives. Brigham's net worth at the time was roughly 100 times more than other members of the church, and was large enough to retire all perpetual immigration fund debt if he had chosen to liquidate his holdings. In 1856, money that had previously been spent on wagons to aid immigrants was spent on other things. This is an excerpt from a talk Brigham gave in 1852, where he explains he had decided to give up manual labor. I include a few additional passages to help you understand how much Brigham Young was concerned about and focused on control. In his words, quote, "This company are controllable, like the ship by the rudder, in a gentle breeze that can be turned hither and thither at the will and pleasure of him who commands." Here Brigham Young is referencing himself. "So with all here present, at the sound of the voice, all is hushed, and every heart throbs in unison in response to the words of praise and thanksgiving to our Father and our God. This proves that the majority, at least, are right, and I have no reason to believe that there is a heart in this house but chimes in with my own. Were I to go to the canyons, the whole camp of Israel would follow me there, and they would not be there long before they would say, 'Come, Brother Brigham, I want to talk with you. Come, I will chop this wood.' How many scores of times I have undertaken to work since I came into this ministry. Scores and hundreds of times when my calling in the kingdom of God was less than it is now, have I endeavored to set myself to work, but seldom could have a chance to do so more than 5 minutes. Someone would come along, 'Give me the hoe, Brother Brigham, I want to talk with you,' and so stop me, and no sooner stop me than he stops also. I have given it up. I do not intend to work any more at manual labor. I do not wrestle or play the ball. All the exercise I do get is to dance a little, while my council room is from office to this room, and from this room to my house again, into my sitting room, dining room, etc." Okay, so let's go back to the assertion that Brigham liked to perpetuate the idea that his managerial prowess made it impossible for money and houses to not multiply in his hands. We've looked at this quote before, but it's important to understand that Brigham told people wealth multiplied in his hands because he wanted them to believe that this was the case. You know my life. There is not a person in this church and kingdom but what must acknowledge that gold and silver, houses and lands, etc. do multiply in my hands. There is not an individual but what must acknowledge that I am as good a financier as they ever knew in all things that I put my hands to. About the same time Brigham kicked off the handcart plan, he gave a talk in which he said, quote, "I will tell you what I have done, for I know that many of the brethren think that I am building myself up. I am. But let me tell you that if I do not build up the kingdom of God on earth, I never expect to be built up." In essence, Brigham felt he had the right to build himself up because he claimed to be building the kingdom up. To understand what he was really building up, we can just look at his actions. Continuing with Brigham's words, "And I would not give the ashes of a rye straw for any man in this kingdom, or for all his substance, who does not build it up, and gather means for that purpose. It is true I gather a great deal of substance around me. I am obliged to do it. I cannot shun it." Again, Brigham makes the familiar argument that he can't avoid wealth. In reality, Brigham, like you or I, could have chosen to use his resources to help the poor around him or to build himself up. Claiming that he was obliged to or that he couldn't shun wealth is just an excuse. Brigham did exactly what he wanted to. He could have used the resources under his control for himself or for others. His own words make it clear that he chose to build himself up. Brigham continues, "I must feed the poor. I must clothe them and take care of them. I must see that they have houses, and when they get so as to deserve them, they must have a team, a watch, a farm, etc., and must increase. But they must work and pay for it all." End quote. Brigham's approach to helping the poor wasn't to share his wealth with them. It was to provide opportunities for them by organizing the economy so they could take care of themselves. Once again, in Brigham's words, quote, "But they," meaning the poor, "must work and pay for it all." End quote. So let's go back to Brigham's words at the top of the quote highlighted in yellow, that "I know many of the brethren think that I am building myself up. I am." Why would many of the brethren in 1855 think that Brigham was building himself up? This is a picture of the first house built in the Salt Lake Valley. It was the residence of Osmond and Mary Duell and Osmond's brother Amos from the fall of 1847 to the spring of 1848. This historic structure is one of two surviving homes built by Mormon pioneers upon their arrival in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. One historical website claimed that Osmond and Mary were among the most prosperous of the 1847 pioneers. This is a pioneer dugout replica built to honor those who survived the first winter in Manti in 1849. This is a picture of a trading post that members of the Mormon Battalion built in Nevada in 1851. And this is a picture from Jones Hughes Pioneer Park in Spanish Fork that has almost every type of housing option that was available to pioneers and settlers in the 1800s, from a one-room dugout to spacious Icelandic and Danish log cabins. Compare these types of structures with the following houses that Brigham Young built for himself and his families in 1854 and 1856. In 1854, construction on this structure, the Beehive House, was completed. We can see why Brigham would say the next year in a church talk, "I know that many of the brethren think that I am building myself up. I am. I gather a great deal of substance around me. I am obliged to do it. I cannot shun it." 2 years later, in 1856, this structure, the Lion House, was completed. It had 20 bedrooms. I assume the Lion House was under construction when Brigham decided to launch the handcart plan to save money. Since Brigham stopped performing manual labor in 1852, the money to build these houses had to come from other sources. As territorial governor and superintendent of Indian Affairs, Brigham received a salary from the government, but it's unclear how far that stretched to cover the needs of his many wives and children. Brigham's commingling of personal and church resources, which seems to have provided capital for his personal businesses, and which would later be compounded by the church's response to the 1862 Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, was eventually sorted out by a committee of 3 apostles after Brigham died to reclaim over $1 million of church resources from Brigham's estate, which is the equivalent of $24 million in the year 2020 adjusted for inflation. In 1855, Brigham explained where at least part of the money to build his houses may have come from. In Brigham's words, "I have a word to say to another portion of the community, some of whom may be here today. A great many of the brethren are indebted to the tithing office, and I have a good deal coming to me, and I intend to put you in the screw, for we mean to make you pay these debts this season, and you who have owed for years, if you do not pay up now and help us, we will levy on your property and take every farthing you have on the earth." To Brigham, tithing was a debt and he was going to intensify collection efforts. It's interesting that Brigham would talk so openly about his desire to aggressively collect tithing, and that Brigham had a good deal of the tithing to be collected coming to him. When Brigham says he intends to put those that owe tithing into the screw, I believe he's referring metaphorically to the thumb screws, see the picture in the bottom right, that slave masters used to inflict pain on and thus control the slaves in this time period. While Brigham was aggressively collecting tithing and having these mansions built, members of the church were literally struggling to avoid starvation. This interesting paper, published in the Journal of Mormon History in 2001, describes the famine of 1855 and 56, driven by grasshopper infestations and drought. Referring to the summer of 1855, it explains, in summing up the situation at the end of July, Apostle George A. Smith wrote, all the crops of Millard, St. Pete, and Joab counties, which are all counties in Utah, were destroyed, and 2/3 of the wheat in Utah, Great Salt Lake, and Tooele counties shared the same fate. The northern counties have suffered less from grasshoppers than from the extreme drought. Their crops, however, will be about 1/2 the general average. Henry Emery of Salt Lake wrote that in 1856, about April conference, our provisions began to give out, and we subsisted on roots, pigweed, fish, and what we could get. William Frederick Rigby of Lehi, a city in Utah, claimed that he and his wife ate so many weeds during the summer that our skin became tainted with green. Describing conditions in Salt Lake City the same year that Brigham finished construction on the Lion House, which was also the same year he launched the handcart plan, we read, quote, in March, the bishops reported unnerving destitution. Some of their ward members were digging roots and gathering wild plants. Still others were begging on the streets. The begging seemed particularly shocking, and Bishop Edwin D. Woolley of Salt Lake's 13th Ward recommended that none should be allowed to go out of the ward to beg unless the bishops can't supply them, in which case let the bishop give them a writing for a certain number of days stating they are destitute and worthy to be relieved. As it is at present, the beggars have more provisions from day to day than those have who give unto them. Bishop Isaac Hill of Salt Lake's 2nd Ward had instructed his ward members not to beg, but rather to work at digging roots, of which he could dig a bushel a day. So this is the context. Brigham's threatening the saints that owe unpaid tithing that he's going to put them into the screw, and a good deal of it is coming to Brigham himself. Members are literally digging roots and eating weeds to avoid starvation. At the same time, Brigham discontinues wagon trains to save money while finishing construction on his 2nd mansion. When news of increasing handcart deaths renders Brigham's prophecy that nothing shall hinder or stay the handcart pioneers false, Brigham misrepresents what he knew and when he knew it to shift blame to other leaders for the over 200 deaths. In his Economic History of the Church from 1830 to 1900, Leonard Arrington, who is later called as the Church's historian, provides insight into some interesting financial considerations. The need for additional funds, quote, led the church to revive in 1854 the original law of consecration, end quote. The author continues, during the period 1855-1856, about 40% of the 7,000 heads of family in the territory deeded all of their property to the church. Brigham Young consecrated a list of real and personal property valued at $199,625, which is the equivalent of $5.8 million in 2020. In contrast, a typical family's consecration was valued at roughly $2,000. Brigham's resources, less than 10 years after their arrival in the valley and 4 years after he stopped performing manual labor, were 100 times greater than the average member's. The Perpetual Immigration Fund had roughly $160,000 in unpaid debt through the end of 1855. Brigham, ostensibly, had enough resources to liquidate personal holdings, pay off all outstanding PEF debts, and still control 20 times more resources than the average member head of household. Instead, Brigham launched the handcart plan to save money, and over 200 died. In Saints version 2, the church says this about Brigham's announcement of the rescue. In church services the next day, Brigham spoke urgently about the imperiled emigrants. They must be brought here. We must send assistance to them, he declared. That is my religion. That is the dictation of the Holy Ghost that I possess. It is to save the people. The church makes no mention of the fact that nearly a month after Brigham claimed that the dictation of the Holy Ghost to him was to save the people, he intentionally diverted resources from the rescue of the handcart pioneers to ensure the delivery of supplies to Salt Lake that included a rusting steam engine, damaged books, and large amounts of liquor and tobacco. On October 5th, 1856, the day after Franklin D. Richards and the other elders arrived in Salt Lake, Brigham understood that the handcart saints faced serious risks. In his words, "This is the salvation I am now seeking for, to save our brethren that would be apt to perish, or suffer extremely if we do not send them assistance." 3.5 weeks later, Brigham understood that severe weather had already begun to afflict the handcart companies. In an October 30th letter to Orson Pratt, Brigham repeated what he knew from an express letter he'd received from the Willie Company that, quote, Captain Willie's company had a pretty severe time in a storm that lasted 2 days and then cleared up cold. Abraham Owen Smoot, mayor of Salt Lake and captain of the church's 1856 supply train bringing goods from the east to Salt Lake, was traveling westward in between the Willie and Martin companies when he arrived at Fort Bridger, Wyoming, and wrote the following to Brigham on October 28th. "After traveling through a long and tedious snowstorm for the last 7 or 8 days, I find myself at this place with a broken down set of teams with which I shall be unable to move all my train any farther." Captain Smoot left 8 wagons at the fort for the winter, which included the books, thrashing machine, your engine and fixtures, and part of the nails, glass and groceries, and perhaps a portion of the dry goods. Brigham replied to this letter on October 31st. This map illustrates that Fort Bridger was the last fort on the westward trail before Salt Lake. Knowing that the handcart pioneers were continuously confronting severe weather, Brigham nonetheless ordered Captain Smoot to retrieve the supplies left behind at Fort Bridger. Brigham's October 31st reply, sent as an express letter, told Captain Smoot to bring in the steam engine and other supplies, and that if they didn't have enough wagon teams to do the job, they were to call upon the brethren who were out in the mountains with ox teams to assist the handcart immigration to instead get the supplies. Brigham intentionally diverted wagon teams from the rescue of the handcart pioneers to bring in a rusting steam engine, some damaged books, and tons of liquor and tobacco to Salt Lake. It's fascinating that, based on a letter Brigham would write to one of his sons years later, we know Brigham was addicted to tobacco at the time he ordered Captain Smoot to reassign men and resources from helping the handcart saints to bringing in the shipment of liquor and tobacco. This is the letter Brigham wrote to Captain Smoot of the supply train. In Brigham's words, "As the weather has grown milder, there is no necessity for leaving any wagons and property at Bridger. Hence, I wish all brought in." It's fascinating that Brigham's stated rationale for ordering resources to be diverted from saving the handcart pioneers to bring in supply wagons stored at Fort Bridger was because, quote, "the weather has grown milder," end quote. If the weather in Salt Lake, when Brigham wrote the letter, was milder, it didn't stop harsh weather from continuing to afflict the handcart saints on the rest of their journey. The journal kept by the camp clerk for the Willie Company explained what happened to the company after they received Brigham's orders to reassign men and resources that had arrived from Utah to help them. The journal reads, November 4th, Franklin B. Willie came on from A.O. Smoot's train, informing the company that President B. Young had sent word that some freight still lying at Bridger was to be brought in this season and that some teams and men of our company were needed to go on to Bridger. Several teams and men were selected for the trip. November 5th, Peter Madsen from Copenhagen, Denmark, aged 66 years, died during the day. Susanna Osborne from Norwich, Norfolk, England, aged 33 years, died this day. A snowstorm came on this evening. The people are much exposed to cold from lying on the cold ground. November 6th, Archibald McPhail from Greenock, Agleshire, Scotland, died about 2 a.m., aged 40 years. Much snow on the ground this morning and still more falling. Go down Echo Canyon, roads very bad at the crossing of streams, forded Weber River and camped on its banks. It snowed most of the day. The camping ground presented a most dismal appearance, and we rolled on to it, there being much snow on the ground and it being late at night. Rasmus P. Hansen from Land, Denmark, aged 16 years, died this evening. November 7th, Maria S. Jorgen from Lango, Denmark, aged 8 years, died. Theophilus Cox from Bristol, Somersetshire, England, aged 25 years, died. William Empey from Eaton Bay, Bedfordshire, England, aged 9 years, died. November 9th, early this morning, the people were busy preparing to enter the valley. Rhoda P. Oakley from Eldersfield, Worcestershire, England, aged 11 years, died this morning. For reference, this is the source for the Willie Company Journal on the church's website, indicating Brigham's orders to divert resources from the rescue to bring in the liquor and tobacco instead. Quote, President B. Young had sent word that some freight still lying at Fort Bridger was to be brought in this season and that some teams and men of our company, that's the Willie Company, were needed to go on to Bridger. Several teams and men were selected for the trip, end quote. Nobody knows if any of the 8 pioneers that died in between the time that Brigham diverted resources to bring in his supplies and the time that pioneers arrived in Salt Lake could have been avoided, but 3 of them were young children, ages 11, 9, and 8 years old. Why Brigham would place such importance on these supplies in the midst of this human catastrophe is puzzling. The wagons stored at Fort Bridger included Brigham's own private supplies, but Captain Smoot had already told Brigham that, quote, the boiler and other machinery is more or less rusted by exposure to the weather, and the books, I fear, are some damaged also, end quote. The most perplexing of the stored wagons Brigham ordered to be retrieved were a California wagon marked Pacific Distillery and the 6 tons of goods carried in Brigham Young's 3 private wagons, that's 2 tons per wagon, which contained, according to the wagon train's clerk, a large supply of tobacco, rum, whiskey, brandy, and other liquors, also tea and coffee. 2 days after Brigham wrote the letter ordering men and teams to be diverted from the rescue of the Handcart saints to bring in tons of stored liquor and tobacco, Brigham said this in a church talk delivered at the Tabernacle, in which he blamed other church leaders for the deaths of the Handcart pioneers. But the very spirit some have in them of pride, arrogance, and self-esteem has led men and women to die on the plains by scores. At least their folly has. Brigham knew many handcart pioneers were dying when he diverted the rescue resources. I agree with Brigham that the folly by church leaders killed many on the plains in 1856, but Brigham was not exempt from blame. If the only things you know about Brigham Young are what you've read in church publications, you probably have no idea who Brigham Young really was. The most important lesson I learned working as a church employee for over 9 years was that I could never trust anything the church published. That wasn't because anybody I met while working at the church was necessarily nefarious. It was because the desire for truth, to understand things as they really are, was less important than trying to make the church look good. Truth, not image based on manufactured, distorted, and incomplete stories from the past, is what, according to the Savior, will make us free. Let's consider another specific example of this. Look at the way the church talks about the actions of Apostle Franklin D. Richards and his role in encouraging the members of the Martin Handcart Company to cross the plains late in the season. Let's consider this excerpt from Saints Volume 2. Quote, toward the end of August, the company stopped in a town called Florence, not far from the old winter quarters site. Franklin Richards, who was traveling with a smaller and faster-moving company of returned missionaries, was already there, preparing to continue on to Utah for the upcoming General Conference. In a meeting, Franklin discussed with company leaders whether the emigrants should spend the winter in Florence or continue to Zion, despite the risk of meeting bad weather on the trail ahead. Knowing this, some men urged Franklin to recommend wintering the company in Florence. Others counseled him to send the emigrants on to Zion, regardless of the danger. 2 weeks earlier, the Willie Handcart Company had faced the same dilemma, and most members had decided to move ahead on the advice of Captain Willie and other leaders who promised that God would protect them from harm. Franklin also had faith that God would open a way for the emigrants to arrive safely in the valley, but he wanted them to decide for themselves if they should stay or go. Gathering the companies together, Franklin warned them about the dangers of traveling so late in the immigration season. Some infants and elderly saints would likely perish, he said. Other members of the company would suffer disease and exhaustion. If the emigrants wanted, they could spend the winter in Florence, living off the provisions already purchased for their journey. Franklin even offered to buy additional provisions for their stay. Several returning missionaries spoke after Franklin. Most encouraged the saints to continue to the valley. Brigham Young's son, Joseph, urged them not to press forward that season. Such would cause untold agony, sickness, and much loss of life, he said. I do not wish such upon my conscience, but wish all to stay here for the winter and then go on in the spring. When the missionaries finished, Franklin arose again and asked the immigrants to vote on the matter. If you knew that you should be swallowed up in storms, he asked, would you stop or turn back? With cheers, most emigrants removed their hats, raised their hands, and voted to continue to Zion. In the church's account, Apostle Richards warned them, that is, the handcart pioneers, to decide for themselves if they should stay or go. He then warned them about the dangers of traveling so late, implying he understood the risks better than they did. Franklin offered to buy them additional provisions for their stay, clearly a significant encouragement to stay in Nebraska for the winter. And then he asked them to vote on the matter, wherein they decided for themselves to go forward to Utah. Contrast this portrayal from Saints Volume 2 with the following account from the journal of one of the pioneers who actually attended the meeting. John Bond's account of his experience crossing the plains is recorded in his memoir entitled Handcarts West in '56, which the church cites as a source several times in Saints Volume 2. He paints a different picture of Apostle Richard's interaction with the emigrants. A meeting at Florence. At Florence, we found Franklin D. Richards, George D. Grant, William H. Kimball, and others. As the last two wagon trains and handcarts arrived, a council was called, urging the saints not to fear the lateness of the time. The handcart saints were afraid the season was too late to make any more travel that year on account of the snow and cold weather, which would have to be endured in crossing the Rocky Mountains before they reached Salt Lake City. Franklin D. Richards spoke with great passion and feeling. He told the saints that they had come this far on their faith and had arrived safely. He said, "You have heard the testimony of the former brethren as to your traveling westward." He told them he believed they would arrive at the valley in safety. Many of the saints had been fervently praying that God would guide the apostle and that they would start in the right path to his camp. Richards told them that as they had the faith to travel this far, they had better journey on to the end, and he prophesied in the name of Israel's God that the saints would arrive safely in the valley in spite of the inclement weather and storms from all directions, that God would keep them safe. In the church's account, Franklin was concerned about the risks of bad weather, and the handcart pioneers still decided of their own volition to continue. In this eyewitness account, the pioneers were the ones that were concerned about bad weather, and Franklin pushed them to ignore those concerns and continue, making their willingness to continue a measure of their faith, while prophesying in the name of Israel's God that they would arrive safely, quote, in spite of the inclement weather and storms from all directions, end quote. A bit later in his account, the author reiterates Elder Franklin D. Richards' prophecy of promise. In the name of Israel's God, though the storms may come from the east, west, north, south, and the Lord would keep open the way so all would arrive in Zion. This assurance from an apostle had great effect on the saints. Amen, amen, was called out by many of the saints, while tears rolled down their emaciated cheeks and eyes where such low spirits had been seen. The elders leave all behind, while many are in tears and sorrow, and the great body of the saints seems broken-hearted and fearful of the balance of the journey. To claim something in the name of God that doesn't come from God is taking the name of God in vain. Apostle Richard's repeated false prophecies in the name of Israel's God were clearly taking God's name in vain. This pioneer account paints a very different picture of Apostle Richard's interaction with and encouragement of the handcart saints. Let's consider another first-person account from a member of the Willie Company. John Chislett had served in the British mission for several years and was then called to the Swiss-Italian mission, where he served for at least 2 years before his immigration in 1856, where he was appointed captain of 100 in the Willie Handcart Company. John was sealed to his sweetheart, Mary Ann, 2 weeks after arriving in the valley. Portions of John's reminiscences about the handcart trek are cited on the church's history website. The following quotes are not necessarily in chronological order. Brother Chislett provides some important context for why the handcart trains may have been especially subject to the influence by leaders who encouraged them to push to Utah late in the season. He wrote, "Meetings were held nearly every evening for preaching, counsel, and prayer, the chief feature of the preaching being, 'Obey your leaders in all things.'" He then goes on to describe a large meeting that was held to decide whether they should stay in Nebraska or proceed to Utah that year. Apostle Richards was not in attendance at the meeting. Brother Chislett explains, "The elders seemed to be divided in their judgment as to the practicability of our reaching Utah in safety at so late a season of the year, and the idea was entertained for a day or two of making our winter quarters on the Elkhorn, Wood River, or some eligible location in Nebraska, but it did not meet with general approval. A monster meeting was called to consult the people about it. The emigrants were entirely ignorant of the country and climate, simple, honest, eager to go to Zion at once, and obedient as little children to the servants of God. Under these circumstances, it was natural that they should have their destinies in the hands of the elders. There were but 4 men in our company who had been to the valley, that is, Willie, Atwood, Savage, and Woodward. But there were several at Florence superintending the immigration, among whom elders G.D. Grant, W.H. Kimball occupied the most prominent position. These men all talked at the meeting just mentioned, and all, with one exception, favored going on. They prophesied in the name of God that we should get through in safety. Were we not God's people, and would he not protect us? Even the elements he would arrange for our good, etc." But Levi Savage used his common sense and his knowledge of the country. He declared positively that to his certain knowledge we would not cross the mountains with a mixed company of aged people, women, and little children so late in the season without much suffering, sickness, and death. He therefore advised going into winter quarters without delay. But he was rebuked by the other elders for want of faith, one elder even declaring that he would guarantee to eat all the snow that fell on us between Florence and Salt Lake City. Incidentally, that elder was Heber C. Kimball's son. Savage was accordingly defeated, as the majority were against him. He then added, "Brethren and sisters, what I have said I know to be true. But, seeing you are to go forward, I will go with you, will help you all I can, will work with you, will rest with you, will suffer with you, and if necessary, I will die with you. May God in his mercy bless and preserve us. Amen." Brother Savage was true to his word. No man worked harder than he to alleviate the sufferings which he had foreseen when he had to endure it. Oh, had the judgment of this one clear-headed man been heeded, what scenes of suffering, wretchedness, and death would have been prevented. But he was overwhelmed with the religious fanaticism and blind faith of others who thought the very elements would be changed or influenced to suit us, and that the seasons would be transposed for our accommodation because we, forsooth, were the people of God. John explained this about the amount of food allowed to the handcart pioneers each day. Our rations consisted of 10 ounces of flour to each adult per day. Think about how little that is. And half that amount to children under 8 years of age. Besides our flour, we had occasionally a little rice, sugar, coffee, and bacon. But these items, especially the last, were so small and infrequent that they scarcely deserve mentioning. Any hardy man could eat his daily allowance for breakfast. In fact, some of our men did this, and then worked all day without dinner, and went to bed supperless or begged food at the farmhouses as we traveled along. John also explained that many a father pulled his cart with his little children on it until the day preceding his death. I have seen some pull their carts in the morning, give out during the day, and die before next morning. These people died with the calm faith and fortitude of martyrs. John described the arrival of Apostle Richard's wagon train as follows. One evening, as we were camped on the west bank of the North Bluff Fork of the Platte, a grand outfit of carriages and light wagons was driven into our camp from the east. Each vehicle was drawn by 4 horses or mules, and all the appointments seemed to be first-rate. The occupants were soon found to be the Apostle F.D. Richards, Elders W.H. Kimball, G.D. Grant, Joseph A. Young, C.G. Webb, N.H. Phelps, W.C. Dunbar, and others who were returning to Utah from missions abroad. They camped with us for the night, and in the morning a general meeting was called. Apostle Richards addressed us. He had been advised of the opposition Brother Savage had made, and he rebuked him very severely in open meeting for his lack of faith in God. Richards gave us plenty of counsel to be faithful, prayerful, obedient to our leaders, etc., and wound up by prophesying in the name of Israel's God that, though it might storm on our right and our left, the Lord would keep open our way before us, and we should get to Zion in safety. This assurance had a telling effect on the people. To them it was the voice of God. They gave a loud and hearty amen, while tears of joy ran down their sunburned cheeks. Brother Chislett then explains that the brethren in Elder Richard's wagon train made a request of the Willie Company that doesn't seem to have been captured anywhere in Saints Volume 2. These brethren, which included Apostle Richards, Brigham Young's son, and Heber C. Kimball's son, told Captain Willie they wanted some fresh meat, and he had our fattest calf killed for them. I am ashamed for humanity's sake to say they took it, while we, 400 in number, traveling so slowly and so far from home, with our mixed company of men, women, children, aged, sick, and infirm people, had no provisions to spare, had not enough for ourselves. In fact, these elders in Israel, these servants of God, took from us what we ourselves so greatly needed and went on in style with their splendid outfit, after preaching to us faith, patience, prayerfulness, and obedience to the priesthood. As they rolled out of our camp, I could not, as I contrasted our positions and circumstances, help exclaiming to myself, "Look on this picture and on that." My point in including this material is to provide an example of the tendency I saw repeatedly manifest when I worked at church headquarters. The retelling of the handcart saints' experience is done in a way that consistently tries to make leaders look good, even when such portrayals seem disconnected from or even at odds with important historical evidence. Based on my experiences as a church employee for over 9 years, I eventually concluded that I would never be able to trust church publications if I was really interested in understanding the truth. If you are interested in understanding what really happened in church history, you are probably going to have to do your own research. I'll leave links to some papers on church history I've found useful in the description to the video. Not intervening in the weather to protect the handcart pioneers who died could have been God's way of trying to teach the members of the church not to put blind trust in senior church leaders that thought they were in contact with God by virtue of their callings, but who in truth were not authorized to speak in His name. A well-intended false story is still fake. I can't selectively ignore truth and pursue God with all my heart. As the Lord revealed through the prophet Joseph Smith, the glory of God is intelligence, or in other words, light and truth. And that wicked one cometh and taketh away light and truth through disobedience from the children of men, and because of the tradition of their fathers. Our fathers, or our predecessors in the church, may not have understood that they accepted false historical stories and beliefs. If I come to understand that part of what I believe isn't true, I have to make a choice. I can't love the Lord and a lie at the same time.
Thanks for listening. If you like this show, share it with your people. Join the conversation on Facebook, YouTube, or hemlockknots.com, where you'll find show notes and source material for these subjects and much more.